It was a bright, busy afternoon in downtown. The streets were alive with energy, people bustling from store to store, street performers showcasing their talents, and tourists snapping pictures of the vibrant city. The hum of conversation, the occasional laugh, and the distant sound of music filled the air, creating a perfect day for a leisurely stroll through the heart of the city. In the midst of this lively scene walked Jamal Carter, a 17-year-old with an easy confidence, dressed in a sharp, casual outfit, a crisp button-down shirt, dark jeans, and sneakers. Jamal weaved through the crowd, his attention focused on his phone as he texted his friends. He had lived in this city his whole life and was used to the hustle and bustle. It was just another afternoon, one of many where Jamal simply enjoyed being out and about in the heart of his hometown. But what Jamal didn't notice was the watchful eyes of Officer Reynolds, a veteran cop who had a well-established reputation for racial profiling. His eyes followed Jamal with suspicion as the teenager moved through the crowd, a perception clouded by years of ingrained bias. Reynolds didn't know Jamal. He didn't know his background or the pride that came with his well-groomed appearance. To the officer, Jamal was just another young black man, a target of his prejudices. He noticed the way Jamal was dressed, casual, with a relaxed demeanor, and immediately assumed he was up to no good. "Hey, you!" Reynolds barked suddenly, stepping forward and grabbing Jamal's arm with an unexpected aggression. The force of the grab caused Jamal to flinch, his head snapping up in confusion as the officer's grip tightened. "What are you doing here?" Reynolds demanded, his voice harsh. "You look suspicious. Show me your ID." Jamal jerked his arm back instinctively, now realizing the officer had no valid reason for stopping him. "What's going on? Let me go. I haven't done anything wrong," he protested, his voice rising in disbelief. The words tumbled out before he could even process what was happening. "I said, let go of me," Jamal repeated, trying to shake free from the officer's unrelenting grip. A crowd began to form around them, some people watching silently, while others started recording the incident on their phones. Jamal's heart raced as he realized that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was escalating into something much worse. The officer ignored his protests and continued to hold him firmly in place. "I'm not asking again." "ID now," Reynolds growled, looking Jamal up and down with a judgmental stare that was anything but professional. Jamal's confusion turned to frustration as he tried to explain himself again. "I'm just walking down the street. I haven't done anything. I don't have to show you anything." But Reynolds wasn't listening. As the tension mounted, the crowd murmured in discomfort, and some voiced their objections. "This is ridiculous," one bystander shouted. "Let him go. He's not doing anything wrong." But the officer stood firm, unwilling to back down, convinced he was in the right. The growing tension in the air only amplified the injustice of the situation. The growing crowd around Jamal and Officer Reynolds only intensified as the officer's harsh actions continued. The chatter in the air shifted from curiosity to open outrage as bystanders began to question the officer's authority. Some people, who had initially been watching passively, were now actively demanding that Reynolds let Jamal go. "Why are you stopping him? He hasn't done anything." One woman called out, her voice loud and clear, "Let him go." Another bystander shouted, clearly angry at the officer's treatment of the young man. Some had started recording the incident, their phone cameras trained on Reynolds and Jamal. The atmosphere was tense as people realized what was happening. It was no longer just a simple stop. It was an abuse of power. As the murmurs grew louder, Reynolds' face reddened with frustration. He was not used to public pushback, especially not in front of a crowd. He glanced around, noticing some people calling for backup, but he didn't care. His pride was on the line. Jamal, though still confused and angry, kept his composure. His posture was straight, his voice firm, but there was an edge of defiance as he addressed the officer. "You're making a mistake. I don't have to show you anything without cause. This is harassment." Reynolds' annoyance deepened, his patience thinning rapidly. He had expected Jamal to cower or apologize, not challenge him so calmly. The officer's grip tightened on Jamal's arm as his frustration boiled over. He ignored Jamal's protests, responding instead with an aggressive move. In one swift motion, Reynolds yanked Jamal's hands behind his back and handcuffed him with force. The crowd gasped in shock as the officer slammed Jamal up against the side of the police car, his actions far harsher than necessary. Jamal winced but remained standing, not letting the officer see his discomfort. His eyes narrowed as he glanced at Reynolds, now struggling to keep his voice steady in the face of the officer's increasing aggression. "This isn't right," Jamal said calmly, his voice unwavering, even as he was shoved into the back of the patrol car. "You're about to lose your badge." Reynolds, already annoyed by the public spectacle and Jamal's refusal to back down, let out a mocking laugh. "You're funny, kid. Let's see how funny you are when you're behind bars," he sneered, completely dismissing Jamal's words. The officer slammed the door shut with a force that rattled the car. As the crowd stood in stunned silence, some people still shouting for the officer to stop, others continued filming. The air was thick with anger and disbelief. Jamal's arrest had escalated from a minor misunderstanding to a public spectacle, and it was clear that something much larger than just this incident was unfolding. Reynolds, oblivious to the consequences of his actions, walked back to his car, ignoring the angry stares from the crowd. But inside, the tension was rising, and the damage was already done. The arrest had become a symbol of the broader issues of racial profiling and abuse of power, and as Jamal sat in the back of the squad car, the full weight of what had just happened was beginning to set in for everyone involved. The cold, sterile walls of the police station felt even more oppressive now that Jamal was behind them. Officer Reynolds had made sure to book him quickly, his actions laced with satisfaction, as if proving some point about authority. He threw Jamal into a holding cell with a sharp shove, the clang of the metal door slamming behind him ringing in the quiet room. Reynolds stood outside the cell, looking down at Jamal with a smirk. "Tough guy, huh? Let's see how long that attitude lasts once you're in the system," he muttered under his breath, walking away with a sense of triumph. He had clearly expected Jamal to break, to cower under the weight of his arrest. But Jamal, though frustrated, only stared back with an unwavering gaze. He wasn't about to let this unjust arrest define him. Hours passed, the silence in the holding area thick and oppressive. Jamal was left alone, the minutes stretching long and slow. But finally, the moment came, the phone call. Jamal, ever composed, stood up from the bench and walked over to the phone on the wall. His hands weren't shaking, his voice wasn't trembling. There was no panic, only a quiet determination. He dialed the number with a steady hand and waited for the familiar voice on the other end. "Mom, I need you to come down here," Jamal said calmly, his tone almost casual, as if he were asking her to pick him up from school. But there was a weight behind those words that made the urgency clear. The voice on the other end was sharp, concerned, but Jamal interrupted before she could ask questions. "I'll explain when you get here. Just "Please come." The line went dead, and Jamal sat back down in the cell, a small flicker of relief in his chest. He knew his mother wouldn't waste any time. She was always quick to act, especially when it came to him. And now, the situation was about to change completely. Meanwhile, back in the station, the officers were going about their business, some chatting, others processing paperwork. But soon, something shifted. The quiet murmurs started. Whispers spread through the room like wildfire. People who had been oblivious to Jamal's identity were now beginning to put the pieces together. "I heard that kid's name is Carter, as in Olivia Carter's son?" The realization rippled through the station. Jamal wasn't just any teenager. He was the son of Mayor Olivia Carter, one of the most powerful women in the city. The officers who had been laughing off Jamal's treatment began to stiffen, their faces paling. Sergeant Reynolds, who had been so confident just hours earlier, now felt a sense of dread creeping in. He had no idea who he had arrested, but now the implications were clear, and they were grave. Just as the tension in the air grew thick, the station doors burst open with a force that made everyone turn. Standing in the doorway, her heels clicking against the floor, was Mayor Olivia Carter. Her expression was one of pure fury, and her presence immediately commanded the room. The entire atmosphere shifted. She didn't wait for anyone to speak. "Where is my son?" she demanded, her voice sharp and unyielding. The officers at the front desk scrambled to respond, but their words faltered as they pointed her in the direction of the holding cells. Reynolds, still standing nearby, watched in horror as the realization hit him. His face drained of color. He had arrested the mayor's son. As Mayor Carter approached, her eyes locking onto Reynolds with a chilling intensity, he felt the weight of his mistake. This wasn't just a routine arrest. This wasn't some random teenager he had picked out of the crowd. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Mayor Carter's voice cut through the room. The room had gone silent, and every officer present could feel the gravity of the situation. Reynolds stammered, trying to explain himself, but nothing he said would undo what had just happened. His career, his credibility, everything was now on the line. The color drained from his face as he realized the full extent of his mistake. He had racially profiled the mayor's son, and now there would be consequences far beyond what he had ever imagined. Jamal stood up from the bench, calm and composed, as his mother walked over to him. Without a word, she reached out and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. It was a silent acknowledgement that she would handle this her way. But in that moment, Jamal knew the fight had just begun. The tension in the room was palpable as Mayor Olivia Carter stood in front of Sergeant Reynolds, her gaze sharp and unwavering. She didn't raise her voice, but each word she spoke carried the weight of years of public service, of a mother's protective instinct, and of a woman who was done tolerating systemic abuse of power. "You, Sergeant Reynolds," she began, her voice cold but resolute, "are supposed to protect the people of this city, not harass them based on the color of their skin, not judge them because of your biases. What you did today was not just a mistake. It was a breach of public trust." The officers around her shifted uncomfortably, but Reynolds, his hands still trembling from the shock of realizing who Jamal was, remained frozen in place. The mayor's words cut through him like a blade. He had no defense. Racial profiling is not just a policy failure. It is an abuse of power. And you are supposed to be an example of law and order, but today you were a walking example of oppression. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" she demanded, stepping closer. Reynolds stood speechless, his eyes cast downward. His mind was racing, trying to find an excuse, a justification for his actions. But nothing came. He had crossed a line, and now the consequences were about to unfold. The door to the station suddenly swung open, and the police captain rushed in, his face flushed with panic. "Mayor Carter, I'm so sorry. This shouldn't have happened. The words stumbled out of his mouth as he looked to Jamal and the mayor for a moment, before turning his attention to Reynolds. The captain cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but the words came out in a rushed, apologetic tone. "Sergeant Reynolds, you are suspended immediately. Your actions were unacceptable." He turned to Jamal, addressing him with respect. "Jamal, we apologize for what you've had to go through. You are being released immediately. This never should have happened." Jamal, still standing tall and unwavering, gave a nod but said nothing. His expression was calm, but inside he could feel the rush of emotions building up. He wasn't just a victim here. He was a symbol of the fight against injustice. His quiet strength had forced the system to confront its failings, but the real work was just beginning. As Reynolds stood there, completely deflated, he stammered, his voice weak. I was just doing my job, I thought." But before he could finish, Mayor Carter shot him a look that could silence a room. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass. You violated that, and now you will face the consequences. You'll have plenty of time to reflect on what you've done," she said with a sharp edge. "This city deserves better than you, and if you can't see that, then you don't belong in this uniform." Reynolds stood there, his mouth agape, unable to find the words to defend himself. The weight of the mayor's glare was enough to make him feel small, insignificant in the face of everything he had just done. But the fallout didn't end in the police station. The video of Jamal's arrest, recorded by bystanders, quickly went viral. The raw footage of the young black teen being harassed and wrongfully detained by a police officer spread across social media like wildfire. Public outrage ignited, and the city, already burdened with issues of inequality and systemic racism, found itself at a tipping point. Protests erupted across the city, demanding justice, not just for Jamal, but for all the individuals who had suffered at the hands of a biased system. People took to the streets, marching with signs calling for police reform, accountability, and an end to racial profiling. The message was clear. Enough was enough. The police department was forced to take immediate action. Internal investigations were launched, and calls for a full review of the department's practices intensified. City leaders, pressured by the growing unrest, pledged to implement reforms that would address systemic bias in law enforcement. Jamal's quiet resilience had sparked a movement. His courage in the face of injustice was now a symbol of the fight for change, and though the road ahead would be long, it was clear that the momentum for reform had been set into motion. The fallout from Officer Reynolds' actions was swift and unforgiving. Days after the incident, news outlets were filled with the details of Reynolds' past. Complaints of racial profiling, aggressive behavior, and misconduct from previous cases were unearthed, painting a clear picture of a long history of injustice. The public outcry was deafening, and it wasn't long before the police department had no choice but to terminate Reynolds' employment. His name was now synonymous with the abuse of power, and his career in law enforcement was over. But the consequences weren't just personal for Reynolds. They were part of a larger reckoning. The pressure from the community and the media forced the police department to confront its role in perpetuating racial bias. It was clear that the systemic issues that had allowed such behavior to continue needed to be addressed at every level. Meanwhile, Jamal stood beside his mother, Mayor Olivia Carter, at a press conference held in the wake of the scandal. His confidence was undeniable, his voice steady as he spoke to the crowd of reporters. "This isn't just about me," Jamal said, his eyes scanning the room. "It's about every black teen who's been wrongly accused, every young person who's been targeted because of the color of their skin. This needs to change." The room was silent for a moment as his words sank in. Jamal, the young man who had been unjustly arrested, was now using his voice to speak for all those who had suffered in silence for far too long. Beside him, his mother, Mayor Carter, nodded in agreement. She stepped forward, her voice carrying a sense of authority and resolve. "We will not tolerate racial profiling in this city. We will be implementing new policies for police accountability, including mandatory racial bias training for every officer. This is just the beginning." As the press conference ended, Jamal walked out with his head held high. The fight wasn't over, but this was a pivotal moment. The public discourse had shifted, and the momentum for change was undeniable. The final scene showed Jamal walking down the same downtown street where he had been wrongfully arrested just days earlier. This time, however, he wasn't walking in fear or submission. He walked with the confidence of someone who had sparked a movement, a symbol of change. The street, once a place of injustice, had become a symbol of progress. As he walked, the sounds of the city, once overwhelming, now felt different. The world around him had changed. He wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a catalyst for change, and nothing would stop him now.